Hello and welcome back. I am Mr. Sosotris, and this week I wanted to talk about something a little bit different. So there are many debates online, on social media about like what counts as reading, what counts as a book, all that kind of stuff. And there's one that I don't think is talked about that often, and that is fan fiction. Now, I'm not going to talk about like the artistic merit of fan fiction specifically, because just like any written thing, there's stuff that's good and there's stuff that's not good. What I am going to focus on is sort of its value. Now, the cat's playing with toys down here, so that's why it's noisy. Fan fiction is usually written works that take existing characters, existing universes, and they rework them in sort of new ways or explore different things. And this can be everything from sort of published official works to really unofficial stuff that's posted online, mostly on like fanfiction.net or Archive of Their Own or AO3, as I'll probably refer to it going forward. But fanfiction is really interesting because it serves a function, I think, for a lot of people, and it has a value that isn't really discussed. Often fan fiction is dismissed as silly. It's sort of seen as something that like teen girls write, and it's just kind of not worth talking about. And like, sure, there is going to be a lot of fan fiction that's like fluff or just like ridiculous, goofy stuff that, you know, isn't as deep and complex as what you'd get in a novel, obviously. But what I wanted to talk about is sort of how fan fiction works and why it's important that we keep allowing people to write it. Now, when I say fan fiction, I'm including everything from like published works like John Gardner's Grendel to like the X-Files AU where Mulder and Scully meet in a coffee shop and have cute conversations, like everything in there. So it's a very broad term, but I think we will kind of have the same sorts of things to say depending on if it's like professionally published work or just stuff that's published online kind of informally. So one thing that makes fan fiction important is that in order to write it, one has to use critical thinking. And what I mean by that is fan fiction requires the writer to engage with the original work in a pretty complex way. And a lot of times people don't think about it. Fan fiction feels easy when you're writing it a lot of times because the world's already created, the character's already created, and you just need to sort of tell something new or tell a new story using existing characters. And since the people who usually write these are very familiar with the characters, you don't have to do any kind of character building. You just basically take existing characters and then give them something to do. And the critical thinking that happens a lot of time is very unconscious. If you were to give someone like a written form about their favorite universe, say it's like X-Files or Star Trek or whatever, and you were to give them a thing and you said, okay, list the top 3 motivations for this character, what drives them, what is important to them, kind of thing, you'd probably be able to answer the question, but it might take a little bit more thinking. Or say you were to ask them sort of what is the main conflict that this character faces daily apart from like monster of the week or villain of the week stories, and you could probably answer those, but it would require, more in-depth thinking, and people would be like, oh, this is, you're overthinking it, this is too complicated, and this isn't really what I'm sort of interested in engaging with the character. But then when you're writing something, you do have to ask yourself those questions, but you do it sort of unconsciously. So you are concerned with sort of their primary motivations, their primary conflicts. So many fan fictions are based around sort of characters facing dark parts of themselves or facing sort of the consequences of something that happened in an existing story. Say it's like the fallout from something and they're kind of processing it. And that's one thing that a lot of people use fan fiction for as well, is they sort of are able to work through their own understanding of things like trauma by having a character who has undergone something traumatic and saying, okay, how would this character deal with their trauma? And obviously fan fiction is no substitute for like professional therapy, medication, actual medical help, but it's still interesting in the way that it allows people to sort of work through certain complex issues in an interesting way. And so a lot of time people are finding ways to interact with their characters that are previously existing in a way that makes them feel accurate or true to the existing material. And so by doing that, they are using quite complex critical thinking, because in order to sort of replicate the character, it's not just a matter of sort of copying their speech patterns, which, that is a level of critical thinking as well, because you're able to analyze how they talk and then replicate that, but just how they react to things, how they face problems, how they interact with other people. And it's really, really interesting the way that they are able to do that without kind of thinking about the nuts and bolts of it. And some do, of course. There's some that really get really deep into mapping out character, just as if they're writing a professional novel, and they do outlines and character sketches and all that stuff. But it's just interesting in the way that people engage with existing characters and are able to find new levels of depth and nuance by exploring how they interact with the world. And so my point to all of this is that fan fiction encourages people to deal with a book or a TV show or a movie in quite a sophisticated way, even if like you're writing something that's like just the fluffiest of fluff and it's not really meant to go anywhere. There's still critical thinking happening. And so this is why fan fiction is important, because if nothing else, it's at least an exercise in creativity and analysis. And that leads me to my next point. Another value of fan fiction is that it promotes literacy and creativity in a way that other hobbies might not, because there's a community already established. You can post something, and some people will post like a chapter at a time, kind of like the old serialized novels, like Dickens did this, where he would post, a chapter at a time in like a periodical, and so people would follow his novels over time. And that's kind of what this is. It's like a serialized thing. And so every now and then they'll post another chapter, and then people will comment on the chapter, they'll talk about what they liked, and then the author can like interact with them and comment back. And it's very much more, not necessarily collaborative, but it's very much more interactive in the way that people kind of consume their writing. And I think this sort of creative community is really important, because if someone then goes on to write original works, and that's what a lot of people do, is they'll write fan fiction sort of early on in their career as a way to sort of find their voice, and then later on they will then take what they've learned and write original works with original characters, because their knowledge of plot and character and structure has already, like, they've already had a chance to practice that in the fan fiction space, and now they can apply it to writing original novels and stuff like that, which is really interesting. And I think in a world where creativity and critical thinking are sort of flagging, we really do need these spaces. Even though some of it is very silly, we still need these spaces where people can be creative and have that outlet and be inspired to write and hone their skills in kind of a way that encourages them and makes them enjoy being creative and enjoy reading and enjoy engaging with other authors and that kind of thing. So even if someone only ever reads fan fiction and they don't necessarily like published works, that's fine, because they're reading and engaging with other writers, and I think there's still value in that. Now, okay, the elephant in the room, so much fan fiction is based around romantic pairings. You have characters that are put together, and I think this is used sometimes to sort of discredit fan fiction. It's sort of seen as the equivalent of like taking two action figures and like making them kiss, and it's just sort of dismissed as silly. And so a lot of it is silly, and that's fine. But still, if you think about it, there's kind of a bit of an overlap between people who read fan fiction and also people who enjoy romance novels. Now, romance is like the biggest fiction genre out there. It's the most profitable one, it's the most widely read. And even if you love mysteries and sci-fi and fantasy and literary fiction and classics and all of those, romance still beats all of those like many, many, many times over. I don't think people realize how big and profitable and massive an industry romance is. So, it deserves to be respected. But even still, there's enough value in writing and reading fan fiction that even if it is just sort of romantic fluff, it's fine because it's serving a purpose and it's helping people engage with things and be creative, use critical thinking, use their brains, and I think that's still valuable. So we need to not sort of dismiss that. Now, on that note also, fan fiction spaces are often much more diverse. You often have more stories that you don't normally see in mainstream fiction or movies or TV or even romance. You'll have more queer pairings, you'll have more diverse characters, you'll have really good, disability rep, you'll have neurodivergent rep, and I think that's still really important. A lot of people enjoy fan fiction because they are able to write characters who are sort of the types of people that they see around them all the time, rather than sort of the more sanitized, simplistic version of people that you see in TV or movies a lot of time. Even though we're getting a little bit better in terms of diversity and, neurodivergent representation, mental health representation, all that kind of stuff, that is getting better, and I do appreciate to see that. But I think for a long time, you couldn't see transgender representation done in a thoughtful, meaningful way, written by transgender authors, because it was something that was very hard to find in the mainstream, and if it was usually written by someone who didn't fully understand them or was writing from a distance. But with fan fiction, anyone can be a writer, and so everyone was sort of able to tell their own stories through other characters and able to explore different aspects of their own identity and the different types of relationships and stuff. And I think that's really, really valuable because, one, it gives people kind of a safe place to explore that kind of stuff, and also it gives people a chance to engage with authors of different backgrounds who you wouldn't normally see on the Barnes and Noble shelves, that kind of thing. And so I think a lot of people really appreciate the fact that fan fiction allows for more realistic depictions of people and more modern depictions of people. A lot of times people will take characters from like a TV show, say, that was made in the 90s, where there was a lot of censorship, and even though they were starting to get better representation, there were still a lot of sort of cultural attitudes that were very outdated seen today. And so they're able to take those characters and basically give them the relationships and the representation and the character depth that they couldn't get in their original form. And I think that's really, really valuable because it allows people to engage with these things. And when you read something like that, it fosters empathy, it fosters understanding, and there's just a lot of value to that. So even if some of it is fluff, I don't really care, because it's letting people talk about things that you wouldn't normally see, especially things like mental health representation, which even now it's getting slightly better, but you see really good mental health representation, people dealing with trauma and overcoming changes in their lives and coming to realizations about themselves and getting diagnosed with things that, maybe in the TV series would have been hinted at or something, but was never really confirmed. And in fan fiction, you can have characters who have that lived experience write that character with that extra nuance. And I think that's important for people to read. And finally, I want to say that one thing that really makes fan fiction valuable is that, in a way, it's inherently anti-capitalist. Now, I know it uses a lot of time existing IP that's owned by big corporations and whatnot, but what I mean is, people write fan fiction because they want to, because it's a creative outlet, because it makes them happy, and oftentimes there's no way for them to make money doing this. There's literally no profit motive. There's no consequences for like starting something and like abandoning it. So if you start something and you never want to finish it, there's literally no downside. There's no consequences for that. But people write because they want to. And a lot of times you'll have people say that, you know, if people are taken care of, if their basic needs are taken care of, then they won't be motivated to do anything. They'll just become lazy and just sit around and do nothing. And I think fan fiction disproves that, because it shows that even if there's zero profit motive, even if there's zero consequences to not finishing it, people still push themselves to write genuinely really good stuff. And sure, there's a lot of fluff, but there's also people who write like War and Peace length epics with like complex literary language and editing that you'd see in like a professional published novel, and they do it just for the sheer love of creating something, even if, you know, what they're talking about sort of veers away from the established, you know, continuity of the original thing. People still write things just because they want to. They'll take, you know, existing characters and throw them in a completely different situation. They'll have crossovers between different IPs that will never cross over. They'll have sort of retellings of, you know, what if something else happened, and they'll put in so much work to create these things, and it'll be like 400,000 words, and they obsess over the editing and the structure. So when it posts, it's something that you could conceivably publish. I mean, you couldn't legally because it's using an existing IP, but it's something that's good enough that it's as good as published fiction. And people do it just because they want to. And I think this is one thing that a lot of fanfic readers have seen is, you know how like there'll be something that you're following for a while and then it doesn't get updated in a while, and then the person comes back finally and they post a new chapter and they're like, I'm so sorry I haven't been updating this. I got hit by a bus and I've been in traction for like weeks. And like there's literally no reason for them to keep writing this, because they have things going on in their own lives, but they keep writing it because they're motivated to, because they love it. They love interacting with readers. They love being able to put something out there that's a creative product of their mind. And, you know, they still feel motivated even when there's nothing financial pushing them to do it. Even if like focusing on the writing is taking away from time that could be spent making money, you know, that kind of thing. And so I think fan fiction is very illustrative of the fact that if people have free time, they will put forth effort to create art and to explore complex things and to challenge themselves, even if there's no money in it for them. So I think that's still something that is very important. And so to wrap this video up, I wanted to go through a list of sort of professionally published fan fiction as a way to show that this isn't just something that people just write on their own in their own time, but if the existing IP or the existing story or whatever is in the public domain, it's something that a lot of people do and it's very mainstream. And so the fact that writing fan fiction is often sort of disparaged, there's people who do it professionally with older stories and they're doing perfectly fine. So here's a list of some of my favorite sort of professionally published fan fiction works. We've got Zorro by Isabel Allende. She is an incredible writer. She wrote House of the Spirits. What's the other one? Island Beneath the Sea is another one that she's written. But this is her take on the Zorro story. It was an existing story by the time she wrote this, and it's fantastic. It's sort of his origin story, and it's great. It's engaging. It's fun. The language is snappy. And this is literally just like, hey, I want to write a Zorro story. And it's Isabel Allende, who's like an incredible magical realist author, literary genius. And she's like, I want to tell Zorro's story. And she did a great job. And this book is wonderful. We've also got The Hours by Michael Cunningham. Now this one sort of strains the definition of fan fiction, but I'm including it because fan fiction often plays with genre. And so this is very much a response to the book Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. And so we've got 3 storylines. We've got sort of a modern reimagining of the events of Mrs. Dalloway if it was in a modern setting. And then we've also got a thematic storyline that's set in the 50s, which has someone reading the book Mrs. Dalloway and the effect that that has on her. And it also kind of digs into some of the themes of Mrs. Dalloway. And then there's a third storyline of Virginia Woolf herself writing Mrs. Dalloway and the things that she was able to pour into it and draw from her own life and the process of creating that work. So it's very much a reaction to Mrs. Dalloway, but in many ways it's also a retelling in a way, and so I think that sort of makes it fit just slightly into this category. We've got James by Percival Everett. Of course, this is a retelling of Huck Finn from the point of view of Jim, and it tells his story, and we get so much depth and nuance into his character, his perspective on everything, his cultural background, and the way that he reacts to the story, and it gives him a voice in a way that Huck Finn doesn't, because so much of the original book, Jim is sort of he's a positive character, but he's very much sort of just like depicted as a simpleton, and Huck wants to help him, but it's sort of like, I want to help you because you can't help yourself because you're just a poor silly person kind of thing. And this book gives Jim a really different voice and a strength of character and a depth and nuance that we just don't get in the original. And so this is definitely fan fiction, and it's also incredible, and it won, I think, the Booker Prize? Yes? Maybe? For good reason. Moses, Man of the Mountain by Zora Neale Hurston. This is biblical fan fiction, and there's a lot of that, but I picked this one specifically because it's a retelling of the Moses story. She changes things up a little bit and adds in some extra details, and so she's able to explore the story while also exploring other themes as well. It's a story about slavery, and it's a story about coming into your power, and a story about faith and everything. But it's really, really interesting, and it gives you a lot of insight into sort of Zora Neale Hurston's worldview and mindset, good and bad. Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. This is David Copperfield. In fanfiction terms, this would be a Appalachian AU. So it's a retelling of the story in a different setting, and all the characters are there, but they now exist in the 90s in Appalachia. So, still works. This book is incredible. One of the best books I've ever read. Oh my goodness, if you haven't read it, please read it. Now, I know when everyone thinks Gregory Maguire, they think Wicked, and I've been talking about Wicked quite a bit on this channel, but this is another one of his, Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister. This is a retelling of the Cinderella myth from the point of view of one of the ugly stepsisters, and this one is less fantasy and more historical fiction. It is, again, it's kind of a, Dutch AU. It's set in 17th century Holland. And so it's the story of Cinderella, but from a different perspective, and we get different insight into the character and her backstory and her motivations and her reaction to Cinderella. And it doesn't cast Cinderella in a very good light, but this is still an interesting take on the story. Then we've got Kaikeyi by Vaishnavi Patel. This is a retelling of the Ramayana, which is a great Hindu epic, and it focuses on sort of one of the minor characters. Again, a minor character that in the original work isn't given a lot of depth. She just sort of exists in order to be like an obstacle for Rama. And in this one, we get her story, we get all of the complexity that's based around the things that caused her to make the decisions that she did, and it's nuanced and complicated, and she's such a wonderful character, and the magic system in this one is really, really phenomenal. And if you're not familiar with Hindu mythology or the Ramayana itself, this is still an accessible book. you can still engage with it in a meaningful way, and you won't feel like you're missing anything. Reading the Ramayana will just sort of give you extra information about sort of the characters, and there's maybe Easter eggs for people who have read it, but you can still read this without knowing the original text, but really phenomenal. Alex E. Harrow is another author that I really, really love. This is two novellas, small little novellas. One of them is Spindle Splintered and A Mirror Mended, and so that is Sleeping Beauty and Snow White, sort of remixed in new, interesting ways. I love Alex Harrow so much. Her vibe is very much like dark fantasy, dark fairy tale, with really complicated, interesting female characters and good use of magic, and I really, really, really love Alex Harrow so much. We've also got Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. This is a retelling of Jane Eyre from the point of view of the Mad Woman in the Attic. So Jane Eyre, the events of that novel take up maybe like a tiny part at the end, but most of this book is sort of the Mad Woman in the Attic, her backstory, where she grew up. They have her growing up sort of in the Caribbean, and she's sort of a mail order bride for Rochester, and we get so much about who she is, what her culture was like, who she was taken away from, and what would drive her to sort of try to kill Jane, because in Jane Eyre she sets the fire and in an attempt to like get rid of her while she's locked in the attic of Rochester's mansion. Very, very strange. But this book is so gorgeous and just beautiful, and it really gives a lot of depth to the original. And I'd love to read this immediately after reading Jane Eyre, just to see how the two texts have a conversation with one another. Really, really good. And it's short, so it's a quick read. The Chosen and the Beautiful by Niveau. This is a Great Gatsby retelling, but it's also a slightly AU version of The Great Gatsby. The plot is Gatsby, for sure. Like, nothing in the original story has changed, but now there's elements of magic in the world, and so it's almost like a magical realist sort of take on The Great Gatsby, and it focuses on the character of Jordan, and we see what she's doing in the background of the events of The Great Gatsby. This is another one that I'd love to read alongside the original, because they are very directly in conversation with one another, and the way that this lines up with Gatsby is so good, and this book is gorgeous. John Gardner's Grendel is another one that I really, really love. This is a Beowulf retelling from the point of view of Grendel, but it's not so much a straight novel as it is, I don't know how to describe it. It's almost like it's one part Looney Tunes cartoon, and one part philosophical expose, and most of it is sort of Grendel coming to terms with what he is and how he's seen as a monster and what his relationship with the humans is, and he's funny and he's terrifying, and he can't really figure out what he is and who he is. And it's also kind of a takedown of Jean-Paul Sartre, who's sort of, Grendel's sort of based on him. But it's still wonderful, and it does fit into kind of Grendel's world. It is very much set in ancient Denmark, and we see, the human characters from the point of view of Grendel, and his perspective colors how we see them. And it's just wonderful. This book is delightful. It's funny. It's very violent, but in a really over-the-top way. I love this book. Then we've got 1,000 Ships by Natalie Haynes. This is a retelling of the Iliad, and also kind of the Odyssey from the point of view of all of the female characters. It's very much a ensemble cast, and so each chapter, it sort of jumps around chronologically, but each chapter looks at different female characters throughout the Iliad and the Odyssey, and looks at sort of their reactions to what's going on. And so it creates this sort of negative space effect, where the negative space is sort of Achilles and Agamemnon and their conflict and what's going on, and then they fill in all these other characters in the back, like Briseis and Helen and Penelope and crises, and all the female characters. There's so many. This book is absolutely spectacular, and I love it so much. And then, of course, I have to talk about the Odyssey, and we've got Claire North's Songs of Penelope trilogy. This is my favorite Odyssey retelling, and it did eventually end up beating out Circe, which was my favorite before this. But this is just the events of the Odyssey from the point of view of Penelope, and we get a sense of sort of what was going on. Can you stop that? The cat is pushing against the tripod. I know, leave the tripod alone, please. We get a sense of what the political situation is in Ithaca and the tension that's building up, the events leading up to Odysseus's return. We also get elements of the Orestia, and we see what happened with Clytemnestra and Orestes and Electra and all them. So good, and this is like 3 volumes, but it's so worth it. I love this. And then, of course, you've got sort of the commissioned works that are commissioned by the original sort of IP holders to expand the universe. And so you've got things like Kim Sherwood's Double or Nothing, which looks at sort of the James Bond universe, but it focuses on new characters as they're working together to try to find Bond. And this book is so much fun. I have the sequel, but I haven't started it yet. But I really, really, really love this one. And then, of course, you've got the big ones. You've got the Star Trek universe. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of novels that aren't considered sort of in the main continuity. The novels are kind of their own beast, but even still, they're able to explore the characters in new ways and continue the stories from what we see in the TV show or the movies, and they're so much fun. And then, of course, Star Wars is another big one. Hundreds and hundreds of novels, tons of stories, expanding the universe in big ways. In Star Wars, it's a little bit different because the books are considered canon now, and so they are part of the main continuity. And so all of the new Star Wars books sort of are meant to expand on the existing world of the movies and the TV shows. But it still counts as fan fiction because you're getting new writers to tell different stories in existing universes. And so there's nothing wrong with fan fiction. It's alive and well. Everyone loves it. So with that said, I will let you go. I will see you next week. I need to take care of this cat because she is getting very needy. And so in the meantime, happy reading and writing. Bye.